I'm totally good.
Perfect. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome into the Schomburg Library. My name is Chris. I'm your Adult Programs Coordinator here at the library, and I think this is safe for me to say this is the first time I've seen this room this filled ever before. Which I'm pretty sure is your fault. But welcome in. Again, my name's Chris. Before I turn things over to our historic speaker this evening, just a few friendly reminders. As some of you recently heard, restrooms are located straight out this exit door. Ladies is immediately on the left, gentlemen's is a little further down the hall, and there is a water fountain located in between both. All three doors into the Rasmussen room are unlocked on both sides, so you can come in or out of any of those doors, whichever is the most convenient for you. If you need to step out for any reason during the program. Sorry, just making sure this mic was on for my Zoom friends at home. Hi, Zoom friends. You don't need to know all that information, but what you do need to know is if you are experiencing any technical difficulties during the program, you can reach out to me directly using the Q&A. I'll be able to go back and forth with you and hopefully solve whatever problem you might be facing. You'll also notice that closed captions have been enabled for your convenience, and you can turn those on or off as you wish using your Zoom toolbar. And probably most importantly, if you have questions for this evening's speaker, you can throw those in the Q&A or the chat as well, and we will tackle all questions at the end of the program. For our in-person audience, if you have questions, just like our online audience, we're going to ask you to hold those until the end of the presentation, and our speaker will field those questions from you. She'll make sure to repeat them so that our online friends can hear them as well. And just in case, because again, the room is so vast, if you didn't hear it, Leslie will be able to repeat those for you. And my friend up here just gave me an amazing reminder. If you could take this time to silence all cell phones and any other electronic device you may have. Sounds and lights emitted by those devices are distracting to your fellow patrons as well as the speaker. And now, without further ado, I don't want to formally introduce Violet Jessop because then we wouldn't have to spend the next hour together. So I'm going to let Violet Jessop, a Titanic survivor, talk to you about herself.
That I become, the more convinced I am sea life is not the place for a normal woman, even if it does offer her a living. We are constantly at the passenger's beck and call, from very early in the morning until quite late at night. Would you like to know how long my normal workday is? 17 hours. But fortunately, with tips from passengers, the earnings are good for a woman. I have been able to support my mother since I went to sea 8 years ago. Forgive me, I have not even introduced myself. My name is Violet Jessop. Although most of the passengers I serve simply call me Miss or you. Now that the Great War is over, I'm back at work here as a stewardess on the Olympic. Which is not what you wanted to hear about, is it? Most people I talk to ask me right away, is it true you were on both the Titanic and her identical sister ship Britannic, and you survived the sinkings of them both? It's true. No one really ever asks me about the Olympic, third of these three sister ships, but then she hasn't sunk. I tell you, there is nothing like a cup of tea after a long day on your feet. Passengers on this ship just about wear me out. But they're all at supper now, so I have a few blissful moments to relax. I have made 24 trips so far on the Olympic. We go round trip from Southampton in England to New York and back. All three ships were supposed to make that trip. The idea was that on any given week, one of the ships would leave from England, one would leave from New York, while the third was being cleaned and culled. A great business strategy for the White Star Line. For the first time, really, ever, you could have regularly scheduled weekly departures. Sadly, the whole plan required having 3 ships, and only the Olympic ever made it into regular full-time service. Isn't this lovely? White Star Line steamships are known for their incomparable luxury, but very little is glamorous about the life of a stewardess. In fact, White Star Line sent me to an old, established firm to get this uniform. I think the business was as archaic as this fashion. It's supposed to resemble a nurse's uniform, but always reminds me of nothing so much as a prison wardress. I joined the White Star Line in 1910, and 1 year later, they chose me among their hand-picked crew for their magnificent new ship, Olympic. Olympic was the first of these 3 ships launched, and at the time, the largest and finest steamship ever built. And we had never seen such a luxurious ship. In her first class alone, she had a dining saloon with reception room attached, a reading and writing room, lounge, a la carte restaurant, smoking room for gentlemen only, palm court, to say nothing of the gymnasium, the squash racket courts, Turkish baths, and swimming pool. A swimming pool on board the ship. Not 1, but 3 elevators for first class alone, and another elevator for the second class. More than equal to the finest hotel on land. And such a kind ship. I don't know if you know this, but all ships have a personality, and she was as friendly as she was grand. The passengers, however, lived up to their reputation. They expected the very best, and they got it, even if it left us exhausted in the process. I have trudged all over ships, to and fro, with sore feet and worn-out nerves, just to meet the demands of some noted passenger who thought nothing of demanding from us exactly what she wanted. Oh, my dear, I don't want to bother coming in off the deck just now. It's so much cooler out here than it is in there. So I know you won't mind giving dear little teeny weeny, her Pekingese dog, her lamb cutlet and green peas. Make sure they're fresh peas, won't you? And well mashed up. She would wave her heavily jeweled hand and say, I just know you'll do this for me. Oh, you're all so good to me. You spoil me so. I always seem to get what I want. I am a friend of the president of the line. Do you know, in the few short years that I have been with the White Star Line, I have met, literally, hundreds of friends of the president of the line. And poor Mr. Ismay to be blessed with this overabundance of friends. I do like Americans, though. It's refreshing. Americans treat you as a person first, not a servant. That makes a world of difference. And New York, what a wonderful, lovely city. I had trouble overcoming the feeling that those skyscrapers shooting up into the air were not about to topple down right on top of me. And the winds! In New York City, the winds would come tearing around the corners of the buildings, as if their singular goal were to relieve one of all one's clothing. I had never seen so many limbs publicly exposed. But I love New York shops. And the shop girls, if they needed to put their gum somewhere while talking to you, they just did it under the table. And if they thought you would use the wrong word, well, they would be happy to correct you. Now, you mean you need a new brassiere. Oh, because they really wanted you to have exactly what you wanted. And I always fell right into their trap. I would walk out of there with 3 pairs of stockings for $3 when I had gone in to buy 1 pair for $1.10. My first year on the Olympic was over before I even knew it. We had only just learned our way around, gotten our feet used to those long alleyways, when the White Star Line transferred many of us to the Titanic. She was the identical sister ship to the Olympic, nearly identical, but a few modifications make her a little bit heavier, and there you are, the new, largest and finest steamship ever built. And it was true. Olympic is beautiful, but oh, Titanic, even grander, far more magnificent. She had private promenades in her millionaire suites, a Parisian cafe on board for afternoon tea, and like the Olympic, a wrought iron and glass skylight over the grand staircase. The grand staircase started on A deck and descended down through 4 decks to the first-class dining saloon down on D deck. That dining saloon could seat 500 at a single seating. Quite the largest room ever built on a steamship. The china for the second class was lovely, perfectly elegant for first class on any other ship. But for first class on the Titanic, it was exquisite, with gilded edges. I remember, I used to feel this little thrill every time I went down the Titanic's first class alleyways. You would walk down the corridor and you would pass the room decorated in the Georgian style, and then the Dutch style, and the Regency style. Every stateroom in first class had both hot and cold running water. Beautiful silk furnishings, hand-carved wood. I will always maintain, never before and never since has there been such a perfect ship. Of course, when we came on board, the first thing we looked for was the first class passenger list. I remember calling to my roommate, Elizabeth Leather. Elizabeth, come and look, first class passenger list. All the best families, just as you expected. Americans are so eager to be out there on the maiden voyage. Oh, look, Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor. You must have heard he divorced his first wife to marry her. There was a great scandal. They had to escape almost immediately to Europe to get away from the talk. Oh, I imagine she must be dazzling. A woman who could overcome that sort of opposition to marry the man she loves. So romantic. Oh, and Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. He owns Macy's, the department store. Such a lovely couple. I always say they are old in years, but very much young at heart. Oh, look, Miss Marcia Spatz. That's the most overbearing woman I have ever had. She'll undoubtedly arrive, all packages and hat boxes and flowers, never-ending boxes of flowers. Presumably thank offerings for her departure. We always wondered on sailing day, how would the passengers measure up? People are usually quite different from how you picture them. However, the Strausses were, as usual, pleased to see us, delighted with all the arrangements we had made. And another older woman arrived, a Miss Townsend. We knew her because she had been blacklisted by another famous shipping line. She was absolutely unreasonable in her demands. Yes, miss, mirrors everywhere in your stateroom. Yes, of course. And all the furniture? You want all the furniture changed? Yes, yes, of course. The two stewards who undertook that job took the precaution of stepping down to the pantry for a few quick doubles to bolster their spirits. And Thomas Andrews came on board too, the designer of these beautiful ships and one of the finest, kindliest of men. I think he was the only one who actually listened to the crew's requests for our own quarters. The Olympic was the first ship I was ever on with proper bathrooms for the stewards. My roommate, Elizabeth, and I, we actually had room to dress without risking serious injury to life and limb. I used to stop Mr. Andrews in the alleyways, and he always gave me a friendly word. The only regret I ever heard him utter was that we were getting further from home. He loved his Irish home. I often thought later about how much he had longed to return to Ireland for some much-deserved rest. We were all below decks when the Titanic took off on a soft afternoon, April 12th, 1912. But we could hear the send-off, goodbyes, fluttering handkerchiefs. We could hear that din from the ship's whistle and smell that pungent odor of coal in the air. Few crew members ever have a chance to see a ship's departure. I've often wanted to see the ship I was on from a distance, and that day I very much wanted to see her. But soon as the passengers were on board, we started getting calls. Oh, I would be very pleased to bring you some vases for your flowers, Mum. 8 or 10 vases? Yes, of course. Oh, yes. Some of them will be very tall indeed. 8 or 10 vases is the usual allotment for a stewardess's entire section. And no vase is ever more than 8 or 10 inches tall. But Americans, you see, consider it a sin if you cut the stems of their precious American Beauty roses. I'm convinced they grow those flowers entirely for the length of their stems. Now, the Titanic stopped briefly in Cherbourg that evening off the coast of France. Colonel and Mrs. Astor came on board. What a surprise she was! Instead of this radiant young woman that I had imagined, she was a pale, dull girl, hanging listlessly on her husband's arm. Clearly, all the wealth in the world does not make for inner happiness. That night, when I just ached all over, I had just enough energy left to go crawling back to my own bunk, I saw Miss Spatz come sailing towards me. Oh, my dear, you look tired. Are you going off duty now? That is my earnest hope. Well, before you go, you might just as well pop down to the pantry, make me a few sandwiches, will you? And get me some hothouse grapes and some crushed ice and anything else that looks good to you. Well, normally, getting acquainted with a new ship is not easy, but in this case, it was mostly peace and good fellowship. The sky was clear, the sea was mostly calm. Titanic seemed contented, even restful. I even had a chance to pay a few social calls. I always liked to drop in on the ship's good doctor, Dr. O'Loughlin. His door was usually open. I would always say to him, "Dear doctor, how has anyone so kind and so charming as you ever remained a bachelor?" "Well," he said, "sure, and haven't I worn out the knees of me pants, what with proposing to the ladies? Sure, they won't have anything to do with me at all." He was our darling deceiver. And perhaps the sky was not quite as blue on our fourth day out. Perhaps there was a nip in the air as evening set in. It only seemed to make our warm ship seem cozier. I remember the music that night was at its most cheerful. I ran into young Jock Hume, the first violinist, and he told me in his rich Scottish accent he was going to give them a real tune, a Scotch tune to finish up with. He was so full of life. I remember, too, that I went up on deck before retiring, just to get a bit of fresh air. It was quite late, after 11, and the sea was perfectly serene for miles, just calm all around us. No moon, just stars. And a biting chill drove me indoors for bed and a good book. I could see the men way up in the crow's nest, very glad not to have their job that night. "Hello, Elizabeth, you look snug. I'm just gonna read for a bit, is that all right?" "Oh, I forgot about this. No, it's a prayer. An old Irish woman wrote it down for me. I promised her I would read it, but I forgot. And here we are, the trip is half over. I don't know, it's something about protection against fire and water. Strangely worded, but it's quite beautiful." I was almost asleep when I heard it. A low, crunching, ripping sort of a sound. Titanic shivered just a bit, and then her engines softly stopped. Quiet for a moment. Then we could hear doors opening and voices talking softly. I lay absolutely still. I couldn't admit, even to myself, what I feared. It sounds as if something has happened. Faithful old Stanley, one of our bedroom stewards, came, knocked on our door. "I'm calling all our people, sister." He always called me sister. "Anything you'd like me to do for you? You know the ship is in trouble?" No, thank you, Stan." Elizabeth and I got dressed. We said very little. "It can't be serious trouble. That's nonsense. She's entirely new." But we could feel that the engines had stopped. After 4 days of that constant small movement, everything was suddenly, utterly still. I went through my section, tying on life jackets, trying to reassure. "Must wake up now, head upstairs. Oh, put on your warmest clothing, and do take a blanket." Everyone was quite calm. They were probably thinking, as I was, this was all just too unbelievable. Yes, everyone is to go to the boat deck, but just a precautionary measure. Yes, just a precaution. Up you go. They were slow to go up. Some of them were joking. To the very few who showed any concern, I could hear officers saying to them, plenty of other ships in the vicinity. One of them will be with us shortly. I went back to my own bunk, not quite sure what to do. I remember I started tidying up. I think I was folding a nightdress when Stanley reappeared at my door. "My God," he said, "don't you realize this ship has struck an iceberg, that she is sinking? You have to get to the boat deck as quickly as possible." All right, I should probably get a hat to bring with me. I opened up my wardrobe. The only hats I had with me were springtime hats. It was spring when we left Southampton. Who was even thinking about hats for icebergs? Stanley reached in and pulled out a cheerful little number with little artificial cherries on it. Stanley, that's no get-up for a shipwreck, all fussy and cheery. I took a simple hat and I headed out. "Thank you, Stan. You'll be coming up yourself in a minute, won't you?" The last that I saw of him, Stan was standing with his hands behind his back, where he usually kept his evening watch. He suddenly looked very tired. Dear, big-hearted Stan. Elizabeth and I both went up onto the boat deck. I remember passengers were just wandering around, not quite sure what to do. The captain, Captain Smith, he looked disturbed. Passengers would never have noticed it, but I did. "Jock, are you going to play your violin out here?" Yes, I see what you mean. Yes, a bit of a tune would cheer things up." Soon I could hear the band playing from stood on the deck watching. They were playing ragtime. Alexander's ragtime band. No one seemed anxious to move. The Titanic seemed so steady. Someone pointed at a dot way out on the horizon. It was probably another ship. That reassured people. They would bide their time. The first lifeboats were lowered at about 12:45 with very few people in them. "Mr. Andrews, is it serious?" "I know, but I didn't want to put a life jacket on." "Well, to be honest, I was afraid it might scare people." He told me to put it on if I valued my life and to walk about, set a good example for others. I turned to say something to Elizabeth, and I noticed for the first time that the forward part of the ship was lower now, much lower. For a fraction of a second, my heart stood still. And then we heard a shot. Distress rockets. Soon they were going off every few minutes. Lifeboats began to be lowered much more quickly now. People were realizing the danger. We could see women clinging to their husbands before being put into the lifeboats with their children. I was standing at the railing when a mail sorter joined me and said very casually, "You know, mail is floating up to E deck now with the water." We watched as a man ran to the ship's side and flung himself into a descending lifeboat. Everyone murmured in disapproval. At about 1:30, Officer Moody asked if Elizabeth and I would please get into a lifeboat, show some of the third-class women that it was perfectly safe. He looked very tired, but gave us a friendly smile, so we got in. "Yes, Officer Moody, what is it?" No, I really don't think I should." He had in his hands a bundle. It was somebody's forgotten baby. Yes, yes, of course, I'll look after it. Poor little thing. There was barely enough room in that boat for us to sit down. Now, excuse me, do you know English? All right. The ropes groaned as we went down, and it was a long way down. We were in lifeboat number 16 on the port side, right near the back. It was 7 decks down to the ocean floor far below us. Everything was black. There was just the occasional glaring light from each row of portholes that we passed on the way down. Oh, this is a dream. It must be. It can't be real. There were people standing at the watching us descend, quite unconcerned. They must think this is all a bad dream, too. We hit the water with a huge impact. Hadn't we better row away from the ship? You must be a fireman. I can tell by the coal dust. No, thank you. I don't smoke. You have it. You look like you need as much warmth as you can get with just that one thin shirt on. As we slowly pulled away from the Titanic, I wondered for a moment if I just stared at her hard enough, could I keep her afloat? It's funny. 4 days earlier, I had wanted to see her from a distance. Now here she was, our beautiful Titanic, the queen of the ocean, all lit up like a jewel. I started to count the rows of deck lights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then again, 1, 2, 3, 4. I must have miscounted. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, I was right the first time. Only 4 rows of deck lights visible now. The women around me in the boat were weeping, some just quietly and some without abandon. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I was praying for all of them, but I tried not to think of any one in particular. Where was that other ship? And surely she should have been here by now, but no. Actually, she seemed farther away. Strange. 1, 2, 3. There had been no wind at all that night. When a breeze suddenly blew against my cheek, it felt like a knife in that cold air. We were paralyzed with cold. The musicians had stopped playing ragtime. They had switched to hymns. And then, as the stern of the Titanic rose higher and higher and higher out of the water, the forward funnel suddenly broke off and fell into the sea. It looked like it was a cardboard model of a ship, just broken off. There were a few awful screams, then silence. 1 more row of deck lights disappeared, and then we heard this terrible, thundering crash as everything inside the Titanic broke loose. Tables, chairs, that heavy machinery, all that beautiful china. It was this booming, crunching, exploding sort of a noise. The lights, which had been on this entire time, flickered off, came back on briefly, and went out forever. The whole stern of the Titanic stood straight up on end, silhouetted against the stars, and then slowly at first and gradually picking up speed, the whole ship simply slid down and disappeared under the waves. One awful moment of empty blackness, and then this unforgettable, agonizing scream. 1,500 people screaming in that water. It was a heart-rending cry that went on for 15, 20 minutes and then died out. It's just our little boat tossing around in that huge, icy black water. We sat in that boat all night, maybe 8 hours, with no light, no food, no water. As the first rays of dawn lit the horizon, we could see these huge shapes of icebergs around us, like monsters of destruction. There were no other lifeboats visible, just ice and water everywhere. The sky was a rosy pink when someone finally pointed a trembling finger at a dot way out on the horizon. It was a ship, and definitely getting closer. The women around me in the boat started weeping again. One poor soul who had had her head buried in her hands all night, she thought we were going back to the Titanic and that she'd soon be reunited with her husband and her 2 sons. We were among the very last of the lifeboats to reach that rescue ship, the Carpathia. After I climbed up the rope ladder, someone poured a glass of brandy down my throat. It felt like molten fire. I was still holding that baby against my hard cork life jacket when suddenly a woman leaped at me, grabbed the baby, and ran off with it. I found out later she had put her baby down on the deck of the Titanic while she went to fetch something. When she came back, her baby was gone. I was too numb and frozen at the time to think it strange that she had not said a single word to me. It took us 4 days to reach New York on the Carpathia. Such an agonizing trip, so few reunions, so many widows, and so many of our own dear friends gone. Thomas Andrews, Dr. O'Loughlin, Jock, Stan, all gone. Mrs. Strauss had refused to be separated from her husband, and they were both missing. Of the 2,200 people who had been on board the Titanic, only 705 of us made it to the Carpathia. And I went back to work almost immediately. If I hadn't, I might never have had the nerve to sail again. They added lifeboats, of course, before everyone said, well, it was quite impractical. No ship could carry lifeboats for everyone on board. Now, they easily found a way to do it. When the Great War broke out, I left the White Star Line and I joined the British Red Cross. I was a VAD, Volunteer Aid Detachment. But when I became overtired with changing dressings day and night, and I accidentally poisoned my hand with a needle prick, and a doctor recommended I should go back to sea, go back to the air I was used to. White Star Line very agreeably gave me the first vacancy they had on their magnificent new ship, Britannic, third sister to Olympic and Titanic. After Titanic, they decided not to use her original name, which had been Gigantic. Britannic sounds less brazen. She had not even entered the passenger service when the Great War broke out, and immediately the government requisitioned her as a hospital ship. beautiful accommodations for wounded soldiers coming home from the Mediterranean front. Now, I was hoping we might be going to Malta. My brother William was there, recovering from a war sickness, but oh no. She was much too large for Malta's harbor. We would be going to Mudros instead. I still have the letter that I wrote to my brother Patrick describing the disaster. November 21st, 1916. My dear Patrick, I expect you will be glad to hear from your big sister, to know that I am still in the land of the living. You probably have heard all about the disaster by now, but let me tell you my experience. It was sunny on Tuesday morning. When the explosion came, I was in the pantry. I was preparing breakfast for a fellow nurse who was sick. We were all in good spirits because there was going to be hard but satisfying work right ahead of us. Wounded soldiers were supposed to embark that very afternoon. On the lower decks, many of the portholes had been opened to air out the ship. Suddenly, there was a dull, deafening roar, and the Britannic shuddered from stem to stern. Everything in that pantry shook violently. There was no question she had hit something. Only much later did I learn it had been a German mine. But what a difference from Titanic! There, everything had been unhurried calmness. This time, there was no hesitation. Everyone instantly dropped what they were doing and vanished. I was standing there with a teapot in one hand and a pat of butter in the other, and the room was suddenly empty. I hurried to the nurse in sickbay, helped her get dressed, sent her up with the others. The alleyways were already deserted by the time I made my way back to my own bunk. I could already feel the sloping. But I quickly gathered a few things to take with me, my prayer book, of course, and my toothbrush. I had complained to Patrick about being unable to get a toothbrush for 4 days after Titanic. Well, Vi, he said, never undertake another disaster without first making sure of your toothbrush. I put my life jacket on over my coat. Quite disregarding my own advice to others, always put one's coat on last so it could easily be discarded if one needed to swim. I hardly expected to need to swim this time. I was sure there would be plenty of lifeboats for everyone. The mine had exploded somewhere underneath the grand staircase, and as I made my way up its length to the boat deck, I could smell the smoke drifting up from below. But the boat deck was warm and full of sunshine, which reassured me. Then I saw an officer looking at me in surprise. Where are all the other women? All of them? All in the first 2 boats and all gone? I could see them slowly pulling away from the ship. The officer told me that since all the other women had left already, I would have to go in the boat assigned to me, which was boat number 7. Just at that moment, a lifeboat in the water caught my eye. It had reached the water surface safely, but suddenly it was being pulled backwards towards the Britannic's propellers, which were starting to emerge from the water. The captain was still steaming forward. He was hoping to reach shallow water and save the ship, but it meant that as those propellers emerged from the water, several lifeboats were getting sucked backwards right into them. I took a deep breath and I got in. It was awful. Wreckage and red streaks in the water. The lifeboat falls all had men clinging to them. They looked like flies on flypaper. We went down very quickly, scraping against the ship's side. At one point, glass splintered in our faces. It was from a green lit up at night to make a green lighted band all around the ship, so everyone would know she was a hospital ship and she would be safe from attack. As soon as we hit the water, every man in the lifeboats around us began to leap into the sea. I could hear thuds all around, but no shouts, not a word, just dozens of men fleeing, like it was a war and we were all running away from the enemy. In a few minutes, I was the only one left in that lifeboat, except one other man, a doctor. And why? We were getting pulled backwards towards those propellers, which were still churning with this sort of merciless rhythm. I looked back. The doctor was gone. I have always been afraid of water, and I have never learned to swim. But I had no choice. I had to go. So I just closed my eyes and I jumped, falling away into that bottomless sea. It was the first time in my life I had ever been underwater. As I came up to the surface, the back of my head hit violently against the keel of a lifeboat. And then again, another terrific crash on the back of my head. My brain shook like it was in a bottle. Panic seized me, and I started to grope blindly. And just as I thought this was it, this was the end, I rose up to the surface, miraculously flung away from the ship. It was a horrible scene. Wreckage was everywhere. A life jacket happened to come floating past, so I grabbed it and watched as the Britannic took her final death plunge. Just like Titanic. At the very end, the whole stern stood straight up on end, and then she just slid down, thundering with unimaginable violence. Miraculously, only 30 people died that day. 1,100 of us were saved. The water was warm and full of fishing boats. One of them pulled me in, and we made our way to the tiny island of Kea. What a glorious relief to finally reach a hotel and a very welcome cup of tea. Your loving sister, Violet. After this disaster, I was very glad that I had my toothbrush. My teeth were covered in oil and cork dust. The matron saw me as I was scrubbing it off. "Wherever did you get that toothbrush?" Apparently she thought it superfluous to ask if I were hurt or to express any relief that I had survived. I brought it with me. She looked so suspicious and so astonished. I quite believe she thought I was in league with the enemy and had packed a weekend bag to bring with me on the lifeboat. She never thought to ask if I were hurt. My leg was gashed to the bone. Took 3 years to heal. And years later, when a dentist x-rayed my head to discover the cause of my terrible headaches, it was discovered that I had once badly fractured my skull. You might very well ask, therefore, after everything I have seen, whatever would induce me to return to the sea? Surely not the pay, which is really not very well. Or the servitude always expected of an ocean steward. Well, there is the employment. You know, I have no education or training for anything else. But I think, like any sailor, there's a certain hope. There's this enticement I cannot resist. So many places that I long to see. Japan, Java, Siam. I think about the sight of a beautiful dawn breaking on the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, or that soft air, that green, earthy smell of an island as we steam up. Do you know, I can make out the difference between the smell of land and the smell of the sea. Even if I am in a deep sleep, that land smell will wake me up. I suppose it is like any sailor, that hope, that enticement to a new ocean. And as you know, there is no practical way to cross an ocean except to go by ship. So here I am. I didn't mean to jabber on so much. Such a pleasure talking with all of you. I would like to wish all of you very pleasant and very safe journeys home. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. All right, well, in the time that we've got left, let's open it up for questions. Questions, what can I answer? Yeah.
How many people were you assigned to take care of on board ship?
How many people was I assigned to? A typical, and it varied sometimes depending on how full the ship was, but typically a stewardess was responsible, or a steward was responsible for about 10 to 12 cabins. And each cabin might have 2, 4, sometimes 6, but in first class usually up to 4 people per cabin. And the duties were very much what you would expect from a hotel steward or a hotel stewardess, you know, keeping the cabins clean, providing meals if the passenger was having a meal in there, sitting with sick passengers, anything you might expect at a fine hotel.
I have another question.
Oh.
When you left the ship, I mean for land,
Yes.
did the steamship company provide you with housing, or?
When we left the ship for land, did the company provide housing? The answer to that would be no. No. Now, they did provide us with passage back, but that was because they needed the crew in order to work the ship going back. So, yes. Over here? Yeah.
Did your research reveal that the Americans really treated the servants better than the Brits?
Did the research reveal that Americans really treated the servants better than the British did? All right, I'm going to take off my cap so you'll know. I'm going to answer this as Leslie Goddard. Violet Jessop she was a real person, if anyone is curious. She was born in 1887. She was actually born in Argentina. Her parents were Irish. She lived in Southampton, England. Her father died young, and her mother got sick, and so she was taking care of her family. All of which, partly I say in order to say, I didn't even try to do an accent for her, partly because she actually had a beautiful accent, but not a standard accent, but also so it's easier to understand what I'm saying. In her book, and she wrote a memoir, and probably 3 chapters are about Titanic and Britannic, and the rest is about what it was like working on these steamships. And she absolutely does talk about how she preferred Americans to the Brits. Now, she doesn't give a whole lot of examples, and in many cases, the least well-behaved passengers that she describes, she gives them false names. So those who've researched her memoir say some of the people, like Thomas Andrews was a real person, some of the musicians were real, Dr. O'Loughlin was a real person, but if she was saying anything negative about someone, she used a pseudonym. So we don't know if those people were real, or even if they were American or not always. But. That's what she said. So yeah.
Did she work on the ship for like 20 or 30 years, or did she marry?
Did she work on the ship 20, 30 years? Did she marry? The answer is yes and yes. She married, in the book she says, briefly and disastrously. And she doesn't even name who it was. We find out later, researchers have figured it out. It was another crew member, and they realized it was a mistake. But she worked at sea for the rest of her career. She started out, you know, she was very young. Most of the women who went into, working as a stewardess on a ship was a very, very new thing. And to put it in perspective, there were about 900 crew members on board the Titanic on its maiden voyage. Of those, 23 were women. Mostly stewardesses. I think there were 20 stewardesses. It was a new thing, but there were more and more female passengers traveling alone without an escort. It was not considered proper for a single woman to be cared for by a male steward. So the numbers were increasing, but in any case, she was very young. She was about 21 years old. She said they didn't want to hire her because, you know, young women, they might just be looking for a husband, you know, you can't trust them. So she said she had to put on her dowdiest clothes and make herself look, you know, unattractive, and then they hired her. She was 25 years old at the time of the Titanic disaster. She continued to work at sea until she retired in 1950. So a big transition, you know, from that great era of immigration to the transition to cruising. And she passed away in 1971 of congestive heart failure. Nothing to do with drowning or being on a ship or anything like that. So, yeah.
Was Elizabeth a real person, and did she make it?
Was Elizabeth a real person, and did she make it? Yes, yes. Elizabeth Leather was a real person. She made it. I would have to go back and look. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe she kind of disappears from the record after that. Certainly she doesn't come up again in Violet's memoir. Although that was not that unusual. You know, essentially for the steward class and some of the other class, categories of crew, you were hired for each trip. So it wasn't like steady employment. It was just like, you know, they've got a voyage coming up, they'll hire you on. And she had a book, and it's actually I have a copy of her memoir on the table there if anyone wants to see it. And you can see, you know, the dates of each trip and when she was essentially hired and discharged. But she was fortunate to do a lot of them. Yeah?
We do have an online question. Can you repeat how many people survived the Titanic?
I can, and because I am a historian and I have trouble remembering numbers, altogether on the Titanic, there were 2,223 people. That's about 1,300 passengers and about 900 crew members. Altogether, 705 people survived.
And then do you know the number of people who survived the Britannic explosion?
On the Britannic explosion, I actually do. It was 1,100 people survived, 30 died. Now the difference, and actually this is a really good question because the big difference between Britannic, I mean there were many differences between Britannic and Titanic, but one of the big ones was the water around the area where the Britannic went down was warm. And it was not the case in the North Atlantic in April 1912. Many of the bodies that were recovered after the Titanic disaster, they had no water in their lungs. They didn't die of drowning. They died of hypothermia. Yeah. So, which doesn't make it any better. So, was there a follow-up on that?
That was the only online question.
All right. Other things? Yeah.
What were the names of her successive ships, do you know?
What were the names of her successive ships? I don't know them all. She actually transferred to a number of different ships, and even at a certain point she transferred to the Red Star Line, so she wasn't with White Star Line. She did, let's see, the Burgenland, I'm forgetting it, her favorite ship was not one of the White Star Line trips. She actually at one point took, actually I think she took 5 around the world cruises. Which maybe helps us understand a little bit why she didn't marry, because what is the likelihood of a single woman, and especially a single woman coming from a poor background, to be able to travel around the world? I mean, it was not something that was in an everyday experience for someone of her background. And she did, you know, she never had any children, but her nieces, and they provided for her memoir photographs of beautiful Chinese vases that she purchased on some of her trips to the Far East. Just an incredible experience. And Violet is a very good storyteller. Which you can see, all of the stories I told are straight from her memoir. She did have a great love in her life, and it's worth reading her book. Just it's a wonderful story. He was a junior officer. They came from very different backgrounds. She was Irish and Catholic. He was Australian. But she'll talk about funny things. One time they had a day off, and I think they were on an island, maybe in the Caribbean, and they took a walk, and she thought, you know, maybe, I don't know if our families would approve, but maybe he's going to propose. So they sat down on a log and they're talking and she's waiting. And then the log moved and they realized they were not sitting on a log. They were sitting on a crocodile. And that ended the romantic moment. I mean, it's just vintage Violet Jessop, the kind of thing that would happen to her. So, yeah.
Sorry, I realized I misread the question. The question was, is Violet the only person who survived both of those sinkings?
Is Violet the only one to survive both of those? The answer is no. There was another guy. He was a stoker. Did I write down his name? I think I did, because I couldn't believe it. Archie Jewell was an, sorry. Archie Jewell did, but get this. There was a disaster on board the Olympic in 1911. So before Titanic, these ships were so big compared to what had come before that, it wasn't always sure how they might move. And in 1911, the Olympic was moving through water and it sucked a British, I think it was a Navy cruiser, into its wake, and the Navy ship, the HMS Hawk, just crashed right into the side of the Olympic. And it actually broke through 2 of adjacent watertight compartments on the Olympic. However, the Olympic could float with any 2 adjacent watertight compartments fully flooded. Most ships would have sunk as a result of that, but the Olympic was able to survive and kind of limp back into port and get repaired. Violet was on board for that disaster as well, as was, I believe, Arthur John Priest. I know, it's incredible, isn't it? She was either the luckiest or the most unlucky person, depending on your perspective. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
I think as an employer, I would not want to hire her because she's sinking ships.
She says, as an employer, I would not want to hire her. She's sinking ships. Don't let her on. What's interesting, actually, about it, not that they, I think, cared, is that no one really was interested in the experiences or the viewpoints of the crew members. To give you a sense of that, I mean, the newspapers, they wanted to hear from the wealthy passengers, and some of the wealthiest people certainly in the United States were on board. And after that, they wanted to talk to the officers. But an ordinary crew member, not so much. Violet was not interviewed about her experiences until the time of, in the early 1950s, a writer named Walter Lord wrote a book called A Night to Remember, which I think is one of the greatest Titanic books ever written. It might be one of the greatest in history. It's very slim, and it's just a great read, A Night to Remember. He interviewed Violet for that. She wrote her memoirs in the 1930s for a contest. and didn't win the contest, so she just wrapped him up and put him up in the attic. A couple years before she died, she was being interviewed by John Maxtone Graham, who's a famous maritime historian, and she happened to mention, oh yeah, I've got this, I wrote these memoirs, they're up in the attic, and he thought, what? There had never been a memoir by a female crew member on the Titanic. There wasn't that many, and not very many by crew members at all. So he started working with her, and then when she died, with her nieces to get the book published. It wasn't published until 1998. And that was right after a certain movie came out. I don't know if anyone saw it, but the Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet movie Titanic spurred this explosion of interest in Titanic, and that's when her book finally got published. Yeah.
Did Violet ever meet Molly Brown?
Did she ever meet Molly Brown? She doesn't mention Molly Brown at all. If you don't know, Molly Brown was a very wealthy Western woman from Colorado, full of great stories, and she's known as the unsinkable Molly Brown because she was in one of the lifeboats, and she had a big gusto personality. No. But here's the even more interesting thing about speaking of famous names. She never knew who the baby was that she carried. Titanic historians have gone through every single lifeboat and who was in it and who were passengers and on and on and on. In the official list for who was in lifeboat number 16, there's only one child listed, and he wasn't a baby, and he was with his mother. Now, that's not that unusual. I mean, no one was, taking computer notes or handing out tickets for the lifeboats. But Violet never knew who it was. And maybe this is a fun story to kind of finish up with. She said, she was telling John Maxtone Graham that years later, on like a dark and stormy night, her telephone rang. She picked it up, and the voice at the other end said, "Is this Violet Jessop?" "Yes." "The Violet Jessop who survived the Titanic?" "Yes." "Did you carry a baby that night?" "Yes." And then the voice said, "I was that baby," and hung up the phone. Now, John Maxtone Graham heard this story, and he said, "Violet, don't you think it could have been like some kids in town? It's a dark, stormy night. They're playing a prank on you." And she said, "John, I have never told anyone the story of that baby I held that night until I told you." So to this day, it is one of the remaining mysteries of the Titanic. So thank you all so much. Thank you.